Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I'm featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism, Never Again is Now. I am a Dutch Jew and the daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I immigrated to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller, the founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, thinedgethewedge.com. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, surrounded by Jews whose parents and grandparents had come at the turn of the previous century to flee from the Tsar. But 25 years after the end of World War II, my US Army officer husband and I found ourselves stationed in Munich, Germany. And this changed our lives forever.
Today, we have a guest with whom we will discuss strategies against anti-Semitism. Dr. Shlomo Fischer is a sociologist and a senior staff member of the Jewish People Policy Institute in Jerusalem. He taught at the Department of Education at Hebrew University. He is also a founder of Yesodot, Center for Torah and Democracy. His research is about religious groups, class and politics in Israel, and the sociology of the Jewish people in the diaspora. Shlomo, welcome to our show.
Glad to be here.
Thank you. You recently wrote in a Times of Israel blog post that anti-Semitism in America comes from two different poles, from the extreme right and from the extreme left. You argued that these two are not only of different origins, but also have different goals. Could you please describe to us the different origins and goals of the extreme right and the extreme left anti-Semitism?
Okay, right. So the extreme left, and this is something I wrote about briefly, and I have a parallel piece, which is somewhat longer than the one published in the Times of Israel. It's on the JPPI website, if anybody's interested.
We'll put the link at the end if you'll send it.
Right. Okay. So the anti-Semitism on the left is really related to the what I call the totalistic or totalitarian utopianism of left politics in the United States and perhaps in other places, and that's this notion of creating a utopia of complete, how shall I say, equality of identities, of minority identities, sexual identities, and things of that sort. And this really expresses, that was the point of the article, this expresses a long-standing modern cultural theme and modern cultural orientation, which is this this establishment of utopias, and it's very embedded in modern culture. And as a result of which, let's say the target of left anti-Semitism is really not people, it's ideology, it's Zionism, and perhaps in Europe at least, Judaism itself, as being ideologies or as being belief systems that interfere, that contaminate the type of utopia that the left would like to bring. And I spoke in the article about various types of phenomena, which I sort of recognized from 50 years ago when I was a student in college in the United States. This notion of suppressing free speech, this notion of safety warnings, et cetera, and I adduced certain statistics that were recently published in the American journals, in the American Sociological Review, that college students in the humanities and social sciences are not, as we once thought, taught about openness and pluralism, but on the contrary, that they each believe that people finish these programs and they believe that they have the absolute moral truth. So we're dealing here with a system which is very reminiscent of modern revolutionary systems which are called totalistic or totalitarian utopianism. And in such an environment, a movement such as Zionism and the legitimation and the state of Israel find it difficult, very difficult to exist because in Israel, things are very complicated, things are very, how shall I say, complex and gray, and it's not black and white. And if you have a movement, a cultural movement, which only insists upon black and white, so Israel is going to find it hard to justify itself and defend itself. So, and pro-Israel people. So that's what people experience, that I try to analyze is what people experience on the left, from the left. From the right, we're dealing with a whole different situation in which the animosity is not directed against thought systems, but it's directed against people. And it's directed against abuse and even murder of Jews. And we've seen that, unfortunately, in the last couple of years in Pittsburgh and in Poway in the United States. And that has a totally different source. Doesn't have a source it's not an ideological source, it's a sociological source, which is that of as a result of globalized capitalism and technological advances, we have the widespread social disorganization in the United States and in other places and in Europe, which fosters a particular kind of fantasy and anti-Semitic fantasy of a particularly murderous kind. So we're dealing here with, in other words, that the social disorganization, as I described it, which I'm really basing myself on, the seminal work of the Nobel Prize winner and his wife of Anne Case and Angus Deaton, who wrote a very important book called Deaths of Despair. And they described here the social disorganization among the white working class in America, which expresses itself in the destruction of families and in self-inflicted death at unbelievable rates for a developed country. That's death by suicide, death by opioid addiction, death by alcoholism, etc., to the point where the life expectancy of middle-aged white males on the working class is going down, which is absolutely unheard of in modern societies. It's a sign of real social despair. So this social disorganization in which you really can't engage in a realistic politics, and leads one, as it did in the 1930s, 20s, and 30s as well of the last century, leads one to fantastical conspiratorial theories about what's really going on. That seems to be the source of the violent anti-Semitism directed against Jews as people that we see from the right.
So if I understand you well, you're saying both anti-Semitism from the extreme left and from the extreme right are symptoms of a broader totalitarian, or in case of the left, and symptoms of a broader fantasy about society on the right, extreme right, that also produces anti-Semitism. Is that correct?
Correct. In other words, and this has been pointed out, I mean, since, by central thinkers about the Holocaust, is that Hannah Arendt and Adorno and people like that, which was whatever I'm not going to go into the details of their claims, but the point is that anti-Semitism is a pathology that points to something really wrong with society. It's not just about Jews. Behind it is something else which is much more extensive and much more general. And on the right, we have the crisis of neoliberal globalized capitalism, and which is causing social disorganization. And on the left, we have the reawakening of totalitarian utopianism, which we really haven't seen since the Cultural Revolution in China. So whatever's causing that, this is a broad-based phenomenon, and that Jewish organizations and the Jewish community has to look beyond just the fact that that people hate us and want to kill us, and try to get a purchase on the on the underlying social conditions and underlying political conditions that are related to this, and try to address those. And those are the recommendations that I made. So, for example,
You know what I was going to say before we get to the strategies, I want to ask you a little bit about personal background, because
Sure.
one of my own interests is that people need to understand that while the Holocaust was mostly about Jews and Roma and dissidents and stuff, people today must realize it doesn't end with Jews. And if they let this keep going, I think what you said, I wrote a note, was really important. It points to pathology of society that everyone has to realize. So, but what I want to ask you is, could you share with us a little bit of your personal background in terms of that you started out in America, you went to Israel, you know, what did Holocaust connection in your family influence your study, or did you get influenced to study these topics for a different reason?
I'll tell you the truth. I came about, I'm not a student either, really primarily either of anti-Semitism. I am a student of the American Jewish community because the Jewish People Policy Institute, where I am a senior fellow, that's our job. Our job is to do policy research relating to the entire Jewish people, which includes primarily Israel and the United States, but also includes the Jewish communities of Europe, of South America, of Australia, of South Africa, et cetera, et cetera. So I do have a focus at this point in my life on the American Jewish community and its interplay with the broader American society. I would say that this particular, and that of course has to do with my American background. I mean, even though I've been in Israel for many years and had nothing to do with America or Jews of the United States, I studied Israeli politics and society. My American background does, of course, play a role here. I came to this topic because I was interested in extremism. And I came to it because in my own research, I studied Jewish extremism, so, which is a very different thing. But so I was studying extremism, and I said that I wanted to write about extremism and the Jews. So I said, okay, so first of all, let's see how extremism affects the Jews, and then we'll see how the Jews themselves do extremism. In Israel, that's a real topic, and it may be here in the United States as well, but I won't go into that. But so I came to this by thinking about extremism, and I was very influenced by the book that I mentioned and by other stuff that's happening in the United States. I think that I can mention another book if you don't mind.
Please.
It's a book that was written during Second World War by a sociologist and political economist by the name of Karl Polanyi, called The Great Transformation, and that really points to the connection between World War II. He doesn't talk about the Holocaust, but between World War II and the crisis of a globalized capitalism, which has sort of had deleterious effects upon society in Europe and over the world. I think that's, and don't take me wrong, I'm not taking a political stance, but I think that there are pathologies that have to be addressed. So I would mention that. So really, I came to this, through my interest in political sociology and extremism and things of that sort. And then I started noticing that, you have these phenomena in the United States, which is sort of, which I hadn't seen, since the Cultural Revolution in China in the 1960s. I mean, on the left side, and then because of the political events in the United States, I was reading Hannah Arendt. I was reading Origins of Totalitarianism, and I started to see parallels between the development of anti-Semitism and fascist and Nazi movements in the first half of the 20th century in Europe, and certain kinds of things. I don't want to make any gross comparisons, but certain kinds of things sort of rang a bell as to what we were seeing here in the United States and in Europe about the destruction of the working class, the destruction of social institutions, of the family, of churches, of religious life, of the unions, I understand the unions are making a little bit of a comeback now, of the unions, et cetera, et cetera. So the mainstays of working class, of life, of everyday life are being threatened or destroyed. And I think that if we look carefully at the lessons of the Holocaust and of World War II, those are the kinds of things which led to the Holocaust and led to Nazism and things of that sort. So I think we have to take a broad view here. I'll just say, I mean, I understand that one of you is European, is Dutch, right? So
Yes.
So I just saw there was a movie on Netflix called The Forgotten Battle.
I just saw the movie.
I'm sorry?
I just saw that same.
This movie. Okay, so now
What's the movie called?
The Forgotten Battle. It's about in the Netherlands there and in Belgium. There was battle 1944, 1945, but it involved Dutch members of the Wehrmacht, of the Waffen-SS, Dutch members of the Waffen-SS.
I've seen it. I've watched it.
Okay. Now, but now. So the point is that our modern welfare state comes from after World War II. And it comes from after World War II. And my conclusion of that, which is an unscientific conclusion, but from seeing movies like The Forgotten Battle and from going to World War II museums in countries like the Netherlands, like Denmark, like et cetera, I think that the two are related. I think that the European policymakers after World War II understood that World War II is really a civil war fought in every country in Europe between pro-Nazi forces and between pro-democratic forces in every country. In Denmark, in the Netherlands. I mean, the Netherlands had this very strong, I mean, we like to think of the Netherlands as very liberal, but the Netherlands, and you can correct me, had a very strong, there was a segment of the population, a very strong identification with Nazism. And the fact that the liquidation of the Netherlands Jewish community was among the highest in Europe. So yeah. I don't want to go into that, but I'm just pointing that out. And hence, so I think that, so what I'm trying to point out is that after World War II, I think that the statesmen of Western Europe undertook to create a modern welfare state so as to reduce polarization in society, understanding that polarization in society was one of the root causes of what had happened and what had happened in their countries. And I think that the American Jewish community has to start thinking in broad terms about root causes of anti-Semitism and trying to address or at least deal with those root causes. And not only, I know the ADL does wonderful work. They've been doing it for 100 years about toleration, et cetera, but I think we have to go beyond that. I think we have to think much more strategically about the larger social issues that are behind this. That's really what I came to say. And whether you agree with my particular diagnosis or not is less important than people start thinking in this way, in this general way, about the root causes of social pathologies that are behind anti-Semitism of both varieties, both of the left and of the right. That's really what my message is.
And I commend you for addressing that.
Thank you.
Evelyn, go ahead and ask the next question.
You argued in your blog post that the anti-Semitism from the right and from the left need differentiated strategies for combating this anti-Semitism. Can you please tell us what strategy we need against anti-Semitism from the extreme right and why you think that is the best strategy for this kind of anti-Semitism?
In other words, I think, there's this political debate in the United States, which is between, let's say, the left wing and Democrats versus the Republicans, which is really about redistributionism. In other words, which is taxing a certain portion of the population and redistributing some of that money and some of that wealth to other elements in society. I would like to see a different policy. I would like to see a policy which strengthens social institutions, which strengthens work, which strengthens marriage. I don't care. I mean, I think that in order to combat anti-Semitism, what you have to combat is social disorganization. And if social disorganization expresses itself in the destruction of the family, or in the fact that people are unable to work and lose their self-respect as productive human beings, and people are not able to have family connections, and as a result of which they start to go to extremism, then the Jewish community should be interested in promoting that kind of social policy, what I call pro-social policy. In other words, I'll give you one example where Europe apparently is far ahead of the United States, and that's in the provision of daycare. If you don't have daycare, people can't work and they can't support their families. You can't have normal two-parent families bringing up children in a normal way. So if you say you're pro-family, I respect that very much. And if you say it doesn't, but it means more than just being, anti-abortion. It means that you should provide the wherewithal for two-parent families with children to exist and have happy emotional lives within that family, and not what we have today, which is single mothers bringing up children on the basis of serial boyfriends, in which children do not have the benefit of strong two-parent families. I think that means tests are very important, but they should not penalize working families. So I'm talking here about a general orientation, a policy orientation. I work in a policy think tank, and this is a policy orientation of adopting government policies which strengthen institutions. It shouldn't be just to distribute money. It should be that the end effect is that institutions such as work, religion, family, etc., should be strengthened so that people do not experience this social disorientation and social disorganization and lead them to murderous fantasies. That I think is how the Jewish community should reorient itself. That's just one suggestion. I'm sure there are others just as good, but the orientation is what interests me, not the specific policy recommendation. I just gave a couple of examples about something that's oriented towards strengthening social institutions. America is not good at that. Europe is better at that. But that's something that I think that the Jewish community has a real interest in doing those things.
Thank you.
The other thing on the left is to try to promote, and you say you're not political, and I understand that, and I don't want to be politically. I'm a social scientist. I'm not a politician. But I think that on the left, you have to promote those kinds of policies which promote pluralism, which are less ideological and more realistically based, and address more the real concerns of people, and not some sort of utopian aspect. If you deal with the real concerns of people, you can be open to a pluralistic approach. And that I think that this utopianism is very dangerous. It was very dangerous 50 years, 70, 80 years ago. It's very dangerous today. And this is something which all the Jewish intellectuals were aware of in the mid-century. Isaiah Berlin and Yaakov Talmon and Hannah Arendt and all these people, they understood that when you come to totalitarian utopianism, the Jews really suffer. And they suffered in totalitarian societies, both in Nazi Germany, of course, but also in the Soviet Union. I mean, and this is something that I think the Jewish community does realize and should implement more and use its own resources so as to promote much more moderate and pluralistic type of politics. And I'm speaking about that 70% of the Jewish people who in America who identify with the Democratic Party. I think that the more moderate wing, and I don't want to get political, but as the more moderate wing, I think should be strengthened, and people should use the resources of the Jewish tradition, which exist, and to promote a more moderate and pluralistic view of things. Nobody has the whole truth. We know that from the Talmud. Nobody has the whole truth. And Elu v'elu divrei Elohim chayim. And these are the words of the living God, and utopian aspirations are not something that the Jewish community, including Jewish young people, should aspire to. They should be educated early on as to the dangers of utopian aspirations in this world.
Thank you. Thank you. Do you feel the Jewish institutions in America that fight anti-Semitism utilize these two different strategies for each pole?
I think that the institutions that do this are too focused on the symptoms of anti-Semitism, if I may say so, and that has to be dealt with as well. But also, but they should concentrate more on the long and larger picture of what are the social pathologies that lie behind it. And as a policy researcher, I try to make that clear in this article that there are social pathologies behind it, and the Jewish community should be interested in them, and the Jewish community should be interested in not only in anti-prejudice work, and I'm sure, you know, and I know that the Holocaust museums and Holocaust education and stuff like that does important work in trying to remove prejudices from young people in the United States. But I think that we have to go a step beyond that. I think it's not enough. I think we have to go a step beyond that.
Yes, like I hear them mostly describe anti-Semitism from the right as a kind of racism that is widespread in the United States, according to many organizations, also Jewish organizations. Whereas what you describe goes deeper than that. It's not so much racist ideology, it's racist fantasy, you say, at the right to solve certain heavy society problems.
Right. Right. I think that, I mean, yes, I mean, anti-Semitism is a form of racism, but it goes way beyond that. And you know, I think that the anti-Jewish sentiment is unique in a certain sense because it has so many bases, overlapping bases. It's not only racism, it's also religious competition or religious difference. It's also socioeconomic. It's many things, and to simply put it into a category of racism, I think does a disservice to the people of color who really do suffer from racism in the United States in a specific way, and that anti-Semitism has other long-standing bases in religious conflict, in the niche that Jews have in the socioeconomic system, less so in the United States than they had in Europe, but still, and in other types of things. So anti-Semitism is a unique phenomenon in that it combines in an overlapping way various sorts of hatreds and various bases for hatreds. And that's why it can lend itself to extremism from the right and extremism from the left. It has this quality. And that's not true of racism, which I think has to be addressed as a separate issue, as an issue. I think that's a real issue, and it's an American issue, and has to be dealt. But it's not the issue of anti-Semitism, to my mind. And
therefore, I often have the feeling that all those programs about getting to know each other better and discussing prejudices is not enough. It's not.
No, it's not enough. And those programs have to be done right. I mean, if you read Alport carefully, and I used to teach Alport in the School of Education, Hebrew University, right? The Nature of Prejudice, classical book, 1954, from Alport in social psychology. And Alport talks about that just contact is not enough. Contact on the contrary, contact can engender hatred and discrimination. What you need is joint projects, working together on joint projects and working together on things that are of joint concern. And then perhaps you have a chance. You have to invest a lot more than just eating hummus together and getting to know each other. You have to actually work on a project. And if you can put that together, it may have some value. But I'm trying to say it has to go way beyond that. You have to try, the Jewish community has to try and think about these broader social pathologies. It has an interest in doing so. otherwise it pays terrible price, which we all know. And which we
Gordon
see in the
Allport.
United States.
Gordon Allport, right?
Right, Gordon Allport, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to list some of these books that you mentioned at the bottom of the YouTube page so that
Okay.
we can share this with people.
Great.
So I'm going to ask you for last thoughts in a minute, but I just want to say something that I just read because in a way it sums up a lot of what you said. William Shirer wrote the book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, but I just read his book, Berlin Diary, when he was literally there as it was happening. I'm now on his end of Berlin Diary after the war. But he, in all my reading for my Holocaust research, I've never heard, and he heard the speeches, you know, he was standing there hearing the speeches. He said that Hitler would say things, this sentence has blown me away. He said, totalitarianism has to win against democracy. And that blew me away because for all my reading, I have never seen it said that simply, but Shirer is reporting in his diary what he heard. And that's basically, in a way, sort of what you said, that totalitarianism wants to win against democracy. And we have to make sure that democracy wins.
Correct.
That's our goal.
Right.
Go ahead.
I mean, let's put it this way. I mean, the parallels are not exact, but I mean, there's now in the world, I didn't want to get into international relations, but the Chinese and the Russians are presenting, the Chinese especially, their model as superior to the American model in dealing with Corona, in terms of economics, in many ways, and in terms of a certain kind of social peace that they advocate. So these things, I think that for the first time in a very long time, democracy is being challenged in an ideological way, which had not been for a long time. I mean, since really since the end of, well, certainly since the end of the Cold War. I mean, communism did present a challenge, and to a certain extent since the end of World War II. I mean, but World War II, I mean, people forget, when I was growing up, so people, I still remember that people said that Mussolini made the trains run on time, and that was a better system than the American system. That fascism was a better system, and that totalitarianism is a better system. So you hear that, and I think that that's something which that's in the background, and that has to be addressed as well. So in other words, so again, anti-Semitism is not a local Jewish issue. This is an issue about how the world and the economy, et cetera, should be organized. And it's sort of like the canary in the coal mine. If you have really serious anti-Semitism, you have real serious social problems.
I think
you have to start taking them seriously.
I think that we'll end this here because I think that that's such an important message to our listeners that I want them to think about this as we close out. We will put the information at the end, including the links to your 2 blog posts. And I hope that we've encouraged people who are in policy-making positions to take this talk today seriously. We thank you so much, Shlomo, for sharing your time, your thoughts with us. We thank the listeners. I do encourage everyone who has not yet seen Evelyn's documentary, Never Again Is Now, to please see it on Amazon or YouTube, to check out my free Holocaust Theater project at thinedgeofthewedge.com. And whenever you can, without putting yourself in physical harm, speak up against anti-Semitism. And today I'm going to add, and work towards a democratic world. Thank you.
Thank you very much.